The fall of Berlin. The final assault of World War II, the Siege of Berlin, begins by the spring of 1945. The war in Europe was nearing its end, and Berlin, the heart of Nazi Germany, was about to face its final, brutal assault. The Soviet Red Army, pushing from the east, was closing in, while the Allies advanced from the west. Hitler's once mighty empire had crumbled, and the only thing left was to see how the war would conclude. Berlin was surrounded on all sides by the Red Army, and the battle for the city began in earnest. The Soviets had been marching toward the city for months, and by the time they reached the gates of Berlin, they had suffered heavy losses but gained invaluable experience in pushing back the Nazis. The Red Army was massive, numbering over 2 million soldiers, and they had superior artillery, tanks, and aircraft. On the other side, the defenders of Berlin were a hodgepodge of inexperienced soldiers, some as young as 16, and older men who had been called back to duty. Hitler's orders were clear: no retreat, no surrender. Berlin must be held at all costs. The Soviet forces began their assault with heavy artillery bombardments, shaking the city to its core. Buildings crumbled, and the streets quickly turned into a war zone. The German defenses, once formidable, were crumbling under the weight of the Soviet onslaught. The defenders tried to hold key positions in the city, but the fighting was fierce, with tanks and infantry clashing in tight alleys, while civilians, who had once called Berlin home, found themselves caught in the crossfire. The Soviet forces pushed through the city's outer defenses, and Berlin was quickly surrounded. Inside the city, the atmosphere was one of desperation. Civilians, mostly women and children, huddled in basements, hoping to avoid the relentless air raids. The city's infrastructure was being torn apart, and there was no escape. Meanwhile, the Nazi leadership, including Hitler, retreated to their underground bunkers, convinced that they could still turn the tide. But as Soviet troops advanced toward the city center, it became clear that this would be the final battle for Berlin. The end of Nazi Germany was coming, and there was no avoiding it. The last stand of the Nazi defenders as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, the German soldiers were given one last order: fight to the death. Despite the inevitable defeat, Nazi leadership insisted on holding the city, hoping for a miracle that never came. With Berlin surrounded and supplies running out, the German defenders fought fiercely, but they were hopelessly outmatched. The defenders consisted of a mix of exhausted Wehrmacht soldiers, young boys from the Hitler Youth, and even old men who had been drafted into the army at the last minute. Many of the soldiers had no choice but to fight with whatever weapons they had, most of which were outdated or in poor condition. But they didn't stop. Some soldiers took cover in the rubble, while others engaged in hand-to-hand combat using grenades, rifles, and even their bare hands to fight back against the Soviet soldiers. The Soviet forces, meanwhile, showed no mercy. The Red Army pushed forward relentlessly, their tanks rolling through the streets while infantry stormed buildings and trenches. The fighting was intense, often happening at close range. With soldiers taking cover in the remains of Berlin's once beautiful buildings, the city had become a massive battleground, and there was no place left for safety. Civilians, who had once lived in peace, now found themselves trapped in the middle of a war zone. People were forced to live underground, hiding in basements or bomb shelters, hoping they wouldn't be caught in the crossfire. The sound of explosions and gunfire was constant, and death seemed inevitable. But still, the Nazi soldiers fought on, driven by their leaders' commands and a sense of misplaced loyalty to a crumbling cause. Despite their efforts, the German soldiers were losing ground. As Soviet forces advanced into the city, German morale dropped. The soldiers, many of them too young or too old to fight, knew that they couldn't win. But they continued to fight anyway, as Berlin slowly fell under Soviet control. By the end of April 1945, the fate of Berlin was sealed. The German defenses had crumbled under the pressure of the Soviet assault. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler, the man who had led Germany into war, took his own life in his underground bunker, along with his wife, Eva Braun. The death of Hitler marked the symbolic end of Nazi leadership, but the battle for Berlin was still ongoing. With Hitler dead, the German military leadership in Berlin had no clear direction. The remaining Nazi forces in the city continued to resist, but their efforts were futile. Soviet forces entered the center of Berlin and launched an assault on the Reichstag, the building that symbolized Nazi power. The battle for the Reichstag was fierce, with Soviet soldiers facing heavy resistance. But after days of intense fighting, the Soviets captured the building, raising the Soviet flag over the Reichstag as a symbol of victory. The fall of the Reichstag was a decisive moment in the Battle of Berlin. It marked the final defeat of Nazi Germany in the city and symbolized the end of the war in Europe. As Soviet soldiers raised their flag, they knew that their victory would have global consequences, ending the reign of the Third Reich and changing the course of history. In the days that followed, German soldiers in Berlin surrendered or were captured by Soviet forces. The war in Europe was officially over, but the cost had been staggering. Berlin lay in ruins, its population decimated by the fighting. The city had been reduced to rubble, but the victory of the Soviet forces marked the end of a long, bloody conflict. The war may have ended in Europe, but the effects of the Battle of Berlin would resonate for years to come. The city's destruction signified the collapse of Nazi ideology, and the subsequent division of Germany would set the stage for the Cold War. The fall of Berlin wasn't just the end of a war. It was the beginning of a new era. This was Wishper's Truth, where history whispers again. For more dark history stories, subscribe to this channel.